welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. We're in a series on the Exodus. What evidence do we have for it? And what can historical and cultural studies teach us about this event that catalyzed the formation of the people called Israel? Last week we explored the 10 plagues, so be sure to check out that video if you haven't already. In the rest of this series, we'll look at the crossing of the Red Sea and the settlement of the Promised Land by the Israelites. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those videos. Today, we're going to explore the evidence for the Exodus. So the big question, do we have Egyptian records of the Exodus? No. Be sure to like and subscribe so... Wait. That's not the whole story. And while it's true that there are no other texts besides the Bible which record the Exodus event, nor are there texts besides the Bible which reference Moses, that doesn't mean it didn't happen and that Moses wasn't real. And just because there isn't archaeological evidence for an Exodus event, as it's often understood, doesn't mean that it didn't happen either. What probably causes most of the confusion about a historical Exodus is our own modern interpretations and the expectations that we bring to the text. You see, we come to the text with certain expectations and biases of what we think the Exodus event must have been like. And when the textual and the archaeological evidence doesn't match our expectations, we don't know what to make of it. It's easy to dismiss the evidence, or the lack of it, and stick with our presumptions. But when we look at the story, and we see it through an ancient Near Eastern lens, the story of the Exodus actually aligns quite well with how we understand a particular period in history. Now, when is that period in history, and why does an Exodus event fit in? For those who hold that there was a historical Exodus, this is the big question, one that much of modern scholarship largely ignores, since most modern scholars don't hold to a historical Exodus event. But as the saying goes, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And today we're going to look at the evidence we do have that points to the possibility of a historical Exodus event. We'll start with a historical period when this event could have happened.
For those who hold to a historical Exodus, there are two positions on when the Exodus occurred, the early date and the late date. The Merneptah Stela, which dates to around 1207 BC, mentions a people called Israel that presumably lived in the highlands of Canaan, so we know the Israelites were in the land by 1207. But how much earlier did they get there? The early date theory puts the Exodus in or around 1446 BC. This is a very specific date that's derived from numbers given in the biblical text. In the Hebrew text of 1 Kings 6:1, it says the Exodus occurred 480 years before the foundation of the temple in the 4th regnal year of Solomon. We know that the 4th year of Solomon was in and around 966 or 967 from synchronisms with other Near Eastern sources, and backtracking through the kings of Israel and Judah to Solomon. This would put the date of the Exodus at 1446. In Judges, the judge Jephthah argues for the Israelites the right to the land based on their longevity in it, citing 300 years since the Exodus. Traditional dates of Jephthah's life are around 1100, so 300 years before would put the settlement around 1400, plus 40 years of wandering in the wilderness for an Exodus around 1440. That solves it, right? Not exactly. There's other evidence from the Bible itself that we think leads us to not take these years mentioned in these passages literally. First of all, Exodus 1:11 says the Israelites built store cities, Pi-Ramses and Pithom. Pi-Ramses, at the modern site of Qantir, was probably founded by Ramses I, who began his reign in 1292. Pithom is probably a site in the Wadi Tumula, either Tel El Mashkuda or Tel El Reteba. These sites don't quite fit with an early date either. Second, the Septuagint version of 1 Kings gives the date at 440 years before the temple's foundation, not 480. This would put the arrival in the land in the early 1300s. And this is a particularly well-sourced period for our understanding of the southern Levant. And during this period, the Israelites are nowhere to be seen. In fact, archaeologically, there's no evidence for any possible Israelite group until around 1200, when they appear in the highlands of Canaan. The early date theory essentially relies on a literal reading of the numbers in the text and ignores the archaeological evidence, or rather the lack thereof. The late date theory puts the Exodus sometime in the 13th century BC, during the reign of Ramses the Great. The site of Qantir, as well as sites in the Wadi Tumulat, were major sites during the reign of Ramses the Great. Qantir was his capital city. The late date theory puts the Israelites in the Promised Land during the reign of Ramses' successor, Merneptah, who perhaps sought out retribution against his father's escaped slaves. Some object to this dating scheme, though, because it seems to conflict with the numbers in the Bible. However, when we examine the use of numbers in the ancient Near East, we find that while they sometimes reflect reality, they often carry symbolic and metaphorical significance rather than strictly recording dates and spans of time. We see the symbolic use of numbers all over the biblical text. Throughout the Bible, the number 40 is used to generalize the length of a generation. Saul reigns for a generation, so do David and Solomon. 12 was another important number in Israelite historiography because there were 12 tribes of Israel. This means that the number 480 in 1 Kings 6 can maybe be seen as 40 times 12, with two highly symbolic numbers being combined in this account. There are objections to this formulation, but it is possible that the number 480 in 1 Kings is just a generalization for about 12 generations ago, rather than a specific number of 480 years. This reading does conflict with the numbering of the generations from the Exodus to the day of Solomon, but here beneath the Bible, we tend to think these numbers are generalizations or symbolic more than they are literal, as we would understand the dates. This may even apply to the 40 years of wandering in the desert between the Exodus and the entry into the Promised Land. It may not represent 40 literal years of wandering so much as the passage of the generation that was at Sinai and the arrival of the next generation that would enter into the land. This tendency to use numbers symbolically could also apply to the numbers of people who left Egypt. The textbook puts their numbers at 600,000 men, plus women and children. We can extrapolate this to several million people in total. Now, even in modern times, the land of Goshen or the Wadi Tumulat, where the Israelites are believed to have lived, cannot sustain this many people. Aside from the practicalities of everyday life, it would also be an unprecedented number of people, even when compared to the largest armies in the ancient Near East. For example, the Hittites claim to have had an army of 37,000 men at the Battle of Kadesh, which was supposed to be the largest fighting force ever assembled. A number of scholars are skeptical that the Hittites really had an army that large. And if Israel had 600,000 men, then they surely could have destroyed Pharaoh and his armies rather than fleeing from them. If over 2 million Israelites traveled through the desert and maintained a mortality rate that rivaled that of even modern times, archaeologists would find tombs and burials of this many people, not to mention the ceramic and other waste material they would have left behind. But we don't find it. So, in this instance, we should not doubt what the text says, but we should examine how we understand it. The Hebrew word translated 1,000 can also mean a unit, as in a military unit, which would mean there may be 600 military units which left Egypt. This is a much more modest number, a number which can be archaeologically invisible. So if there was an Exodus event, but it involved far fewer people than we usually think, what would this event have looked like? When we look at the Exodus story, we can break it down into essential elements. The Israelites were in Egypt, they did forced labor, they left Egypt, they crossed a body of water under miraculous circumstances, and then continued into the desert and experienced a theophany, or a manifestation of God's presence. If we look at each piece of the story, we can see that it's fully plausible within the context of the late 13th century date. The Egyptians certainly kept slaves, especially Asiatic slaves. We even have clear evidence of a sizable population of Semitic peoples in Egypt, particularly in the Delta. The Hyksos dynasties of the Second Intermediate period were the culmination of a long trickle of Asiatic peoples into Egypt, ending with the establishment of Asiatic dynasties of pharaohs in Lower Egypt. Asiatic populations certainly continued to live in Egypt into the New Kingdom. The Egyptologist James Hoffmeier notes about the presence of Semitic peoples in Egypt, quote, "Even the most skeptical historian cannot dismiss the fact that both the Bible and Egyptian sources agree on this situation," end quote. Some of these people even rose to prominent ranks within Egyptian society during the New Kingdom, which some have seen as a context for the stories of Joseph, for example. In the ancient world, forced labor was a common part of life. One kind of forced labor was what was called corvée labor. This was unpaid labor owed to the state that one was compelled to give. What we see with the Israelites, however, was forced labor where they were made to make bricks for Pharaoh's building projects as slaves. These projects were building store cities. Almost certainly these are storage facilities attached to Egyptian temples and palaces, as well as Pi Ramses and Pithom, cities identified as Kontir and a city in Wadi Tumulat, respectively. In the tomb of Hoffmeier, the vizier of Thutmose III, there are incredible paintings and invaluable depictions of life in New Kingdom Egypt. One of them, a facsimile of which is seen here, shows Semitic workers making mud bricks. The same tomb even shows the provisions being stored in the temple, ostensibly in storage facilities like the ones the Israelites built according to Exodus. In other inscriptions, Thutmose III records taking slaves as plunder from his campaigns and bringing them back to work in Egypt. This wasn't just a practice of Thutmose III, though. Many New Kingdom pharaohs boast of bringing slaves back from their Levantine campaigns. In the Amarna letters, the petty kings of the Canaanites even write about sending captives to Egypt, though these were probably in part the children of elites who were trained in Egyptian customs. Nevertheless, there is ample evidence for Asiatic peoples in Egypt, even of them making bricks. The route given in the Bible for the Exodus actually aligns well with what we know about the Egyptian frontier in the New Kingdom. Exodus and Numbers both give itineraries for the Exodus, including a list of places the Israelites passed and where they camped. Scholars have long argued over what some of these sites are and what the potential route is. James Hoffmeier has argued persuasively for a route which looks something like this. Let's walk through it. The Israelites left Pi Ramses, or Kontir, and did not go by the coastal road. Excavations have shown a series of impressive fortresses maintained by the New Kingdom pharaohs on this road, like modern sites of Hebwa, the ancient Charu, or the Way of Horus. These are the places Pharaoh would have marshaled his army before military campaigns. Passing fortress after fortress could certainly make a small group of former slaves lose their courage, so instead they took the desert road past Sukkoth, which is probably modern Tel Mashkura, and came to Etam. The identification of this is unclear, but it seems to be a known place on the eastern end of Wadi Tumulat. From there, they turned back, which seems to mean turning north. At this point, the place names are Semitic and not Egyptian. Hoffmeier argues that Pi-ha-harot means mouth of the Harot, or mouth of the canal, and that this name was associated with a canal system that linked Lake Timsah with the El Bala Lake system. Geological surveys have revealed multiple canals and branches of the Nile which are now dried up or silted in, and surveys indicate this canal once existed, and Pi-ha-harot was a place near the canal opening. Migdal is the Semitic word for tower or fortress. A specific fortress may be referenced here, but it's not clear which one it is, as there were multiple fortresses in the area. While it isn't clear which fort may be referenced, it does seem to refer to a fort outside of the Nile Delta. Baal Zephon is difficult to identify. No archaeological site has been identified as the site. Hoffmeier suggested a site in the vicinity of Lake El Bala. It's here that the Israelites were overtaken by Pharaoh's army, between Pi-ha-harot and the mouth of the canal and Baal Zephon, while the Israelites were camped by the sea. They seemed trapped. But then, of course, they were miraculously able to cross the sea. What was that event like? Be sure to subscribe so you can find out in next week's video.
When we look at the evidence from the New Kingdom period of Egypt with a critical eye toward the biblical text, we see that while there may not have been an exodus on the scale we expect, an exodus event is certainly well within the realm of possibility. While many discount the possibility of an historical exodus, it doesn't seem necessary to dismiss this event completely. Now, some interpretations of the Exodus event are certainly not feasible. A literal reading of the text and dating of the event are not supported by any of the archaeological evidence. The Israelites did not build the pyramids. There were nowhere near 2 million Israelites leaving the delta of Egypt. But this much is certainly plausible, if not historically certain. A more modest group of Asiatic slaves were used as forced labor in the building projects of Ramses the Great, and they escaped their captivity. It's also plausible that such a group could have left Egypt via a desert road and made it to the sea. Now, I think this whole topic is an important exercise in biblical interpretation for us as modern readers. We have to remember that ancient peoples were generally not interested in writing history the way we think of it today, with precise dates and exact numbers, so that their accounts were historically accurate. While the geography of the biblical Exodus account seems to align with Egyptian geography in the 13th century, this same precision doesn't apply to the numbers in the account. As modern readers, we need to adjust our expectations of the text to match the expectations of the ancient writers, at least as best as we can understand them. Modern readers may make the mistake of imposing a literal reading without corroborating evidence, or they may go in the opposite direction and say that the text is flat out wrong because there's no evidence to support a traditional reading. But we don't think that those are the only two options for understanding the Exodus account, or the rest of the Bible for that matter. We can take the text seriously without taking it literally, and we can use the archaeological evidence we do have to fill in the gaps that the text doesn't tell us about. And that's exactly what we want to help you do here at Beneath the Bible. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.